We are glad you can join us today. The subject of our discussion is what biographers can learn from obituary writers. My name is Bruce Weber. I spent 30 years at the New York Times, the last 8 of which on the obituaries desk, writing more than 1,000 send-offs of the dead in that time. And I'm now 5 years into the research on a biography of the American novelist E.L. Doctorow. So the first thing I'll say is that the one thing I wish I'd learned more from my previous occupation about writing a biography is how to finish one. I'm joined today by 3 highly accomplished figures in the somewhat macabre realm of the journalistic mortuary. First is Margalit Fox, my former colleague at the Times, whose new book-length historical investigation, The Confidence Men: How 2 Prisoners of War Engineered the Most Remarkable Escape in History, is being published in 2 weeks by Random House. So congratulations, Margot. As many of you must know, Margot was a favorite obit writer of Times readers, known among other reasons for bringing an uncommonly stylish and mischievous wit to the obits page. She began her obituary of one well-known magazine personage this way. Helen Gurley Brown, who as the author of Sex and the Single Girl shocked early 1960s America with the news that unmarried women not only had sex but thoroughly enjoyed it, and who as the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine spent the next 3 decades telling those women precisely how to enjoy it even more, died on Monday in Manhattan. She was 90, though parts of her were considerably younger. Next is Bill McDonald, who has been the obits editor of the New York Times since 2006, in which post he is required to be on the alert for the unexpected passing of every notable human being on the planet. Among his many accomplishments, in addition to putting up with Margot and me with remarkable aplomb, he has compiled 3 volumes of Times obituaries and remarkably has overseen the amplification of the Times store of advance obituaries, that is, obituaries of the future dead, so that they now number over 2,000. He has also taken it upon himself over the past dozen years to compose annual summations of death worldwide. To wit, this is how he introduced his most recent State of the State of Human Mortality. Death has rarely so shaped the year as it did in 2020. It swept the world riding the back of the coronavirus. It galvanized a Black Lives Matter movement across the United States and abroad, sending people of all colors into the streets to demand social justice. It altered the ideological makeup of the United States Supreme Court so decisively that the consequences of that shift will assuredly be felt for decades. Finally, Adam Bernstein, the annoyingly youthful obituaries editor of the Washington Post, who nonetheless has the deepest obits experience of all of us. He joined the Post's obits department as a writer in 1999, and with an enthusiasm many have marveled at, began running it in 2008. Here's how he described his work last year in the Washingtonian magazine. My favorite movie of all time is Citizen Kane, because it kind of speaks to what I have to do, which is to try and pretend that I understand these lives. As the movie points out, you can't even begin to scratch the surface. I think of it like we're dealing with glass from a broken mirror. My job is to put together these shards into something that resembles a mirror. Okay, so we're going to chit-chat here for a while, and then we'll be happy to answer your questions. As we go along, if you'd like to ask something or make a comment, please enter it into the chat room. And at some point, I will somehow figure out what to do with them. So let's start with the obvious. People will often describe obituaries as mini biographies. How true or not true would you say that is? Margot, we've talked about this a little bit, so why don't you start?
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I can answer that with a lovely quick anecdote. One of my sisters is a poet, and she likes to enter these flash fiction contests where you have to write a whole novel in 100 words. I think it's nuts, but she enjoys it. One day, some years ago, she called me in the newsroom just to say hello, And when I picked up the phone, the first thing she said was, "So, how's the flash biography business coming?" And I thought, my God, it took a poet to make me understand in a really deep way what it is I do. I think, and of course, there will be among the four of us and perhaps among you lively discussion and lively dissent, but I truly believe that for a biographer or a prospective biographer researching possible victims, a good news obit is truly the best place to start because we are forced to do formal and content triage. Any obit writer knows you might have, if you're lucky, an afternoon to inhale someone's life about which you had been completely ignorant and exhale it onto the page. You might have to do that in 1 hour. Therefore, that process throws into relief the formal elements always, and to a lesser extent, the thematic elements that have to be present, that are the most salient. So again, we in no way claim to get the whole life. Our mandate is different in really interesting ways from that of you folks as book-length biographers, but the kernel is there. And I really believe that in terms of form and structure, to some extent content also, if you put a news obit under a high-powered microscope, you would find yourself looking at a biography. Now, Bruce and the others will talk, Bruce particularly, who's in the trenches doing a bio right now, will talk about the ways in which this obit form is both helpful and less helpful. But again, for biographers, it's a really good first stop.
I would certainly agree that it's a good first stop. I would also say that it's probably for biographers, and I know it's certainly been the case for me, that it's a first stop you can make a number of times for a number of different obituaries. I wrote the obituary of my subject, E.L. Doctorow, and I know it's been exceedingly helpful to look at the obits, all the other obits that I could find. Partly because, what I think, I'm not quite sure I agree with Margot that, that if you put an obit under the electron microscope, you actually find the biography. I mean, one of the things that I've been discovering is how many things I left out of my important things that I left out of my obituary of Doctorow, and that's one of the reasons that it seems significant that you want to read as many obituaries and appreciations and analyses of the of your subject as you can.
Actually, I was having this conversation with a biographer just this morning, mentioning this panel, and I think the key takeaway from our conversation was, no matter what you're writing, no matter what aspect of the life that you are exploring, it all comes down to remembering what's in your lead. Everything should support what you set out to initially say about the person. If that might provide help, might provide focus, no matter where the story takes you. Writing on deadline, as being a flash biographer, I think the most fundamental elements of biography come into effect at that point. You want to know, why should someone care? Especially, why should people who've probably never heard of this person care? And also, what absolutely, given the deadline, absolutely has to be in the story. I remember, Robin Williams just died very suddenly, and the foremost thought in my mind was, it has to have jokes in this. You have to have a. Now, the problem with Robin Williams is what's printable enough to put in there. But you cannot have a successful Robin Williams obituary without some element of the humor in the story.
Certainly
I
true.
think one distinction we should make too, maybe at the outset, is that where biography and obits intersect is in the narrative form, the narrative structure of birth to death. But I always think of the obit, when I compare it to a biography, as the top is sort of the introduction, where we're trying to make the case journalistically for someone's significance and importance, and trying to tell the reader why you should read this, why you should go on. About 6 inches or so, maybe 600 words into the obit, we start from the beginning, from birth, and that's where the real biography begins, in effect, with anecdote, with narrative, drive, etc. So just, as I listened to this seminar, what we call it, a webinar, I often think that in many ways biographers have something to teach obituary writers rather than the reverse, and maybe we should have a reverse form at some point on that. But
one of the things that occurs to me is that the one difference between what obit writers do and what biographers do is that obituary writers, we're operating on such a time deadline and a space limitation, that the real problem is that the decision is what to include. And for a biographer with unlimited space, the decision is what to leave out. It's always a question, it seems to me, in any kind of writing, is the difference between what's interesting and what isn't. In an obituary, which is so short, you have to really decide what's really interesting. And in a biography, I think the distinction is a little bit harder to make. I mean, details are what make up a life. Some details just aren't. Who cares? And so you've got to begin making those decisions. One of the things that you and I, the four of us have talked about is that there are essentially kinds of obituaries. There are dailies and there are advances. That is, there's obituaries of the recently dead and of the recently dead, and then the not yet dead. But there are three kinds of biographies. There are books about the living. There are books about the people who have recently died, who are no longer around to talk, but might have a lot of people who knew them around to talk. And about the long gone, for whom no one is alive, or at least very few people are alive to talk about the person. Does any of this have an effect on the kind of advice you might give a biographer? Bill, you want to take that one?
It's interesting, when you talk about advance obits, we obviously do them in advance. We can't possibly absorb, well, we can do it on occasion, on deadline when we have to, but we try it all, we try very hard not to have to do them on deadline, and so we do them in advance as well as in advance as we can, so that we're ready when that moment comes, because a major death is major news, and the website will want to report it immediately and want to have a full obit ready soon. So in an odd way, we're writing advance obituaries while that subject is alive. And so in that case, we're sort of similar to the biography of a living person. But of course, we don't publish that obituary until that person is dead. So we then have the more definitive end of life story that maybe a more complete, more definitive biography would have. So, one of the dangers we find in writing them in advance is that perceptions of the individual can change over time. There can be episodes that might tarnish that person. I think of Woody Allen. Just the other day, we were looking at our Woody Allen advance obituary, which was terrific. If you only count his life up to about 2010, everything afterwards, we hadn't updated it. So I sent it back to the writer to update it with all the more sordid details that have come out in the last few years. So the challenge is to keep ahead of those kinds of developments as people's lives proceed. We have to be current. We write them in advance, sometimes years in advance, but when we publish, we must make them sound current. We must present them from a current point of view with as many updated sections as we can. An author's latest book would be a minor detail we might add, but a case like Woody Allen or a Harvey Weinstein or someone whose life has really taken a turn. I remember Phil Spector, Obit, we had an advance on him as a great musical figure, and he was. But then he was convicted of murder. How do we put that into the obituary? So we had to redo it. We do the very top of it. So anyway, the point is that, you know, perceptions, assessments of people can change over time, and the danger of writing, I suppose, a biography in midstream would present the same problem. I read recently, or maybe a couple of years ago, I read Michael D'Antonio's biography of Donald Trump. I was just fascinated with Trump, not as a great admirer, but fascinated by the man. And I read his his biography from 2015 by D'Antonio. It's a terrific book. It really gives you a great insight into who he was, where he came from. But of course, there's nothing about his run for president. It was published in 2015. So, you know, you can gain something from that kind of a book, but you're not going to get the definitive story.
You know, one other, as you were talking, I was thinking about another biography that's been in the news lately, the Blake Bailey on Philip Roth. And, you know, not that I'm interested in Blake Bailey's, travails, but the interesting thing to me, pertinent to this discussion, is that Roth, was a kind of a full participant in his own biography. Now, the Obit writer, we have an interesting, and kind of complicated relationship to subjects that we write about while they're still alive. Adam, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I have one example. My favorite obit of all time was for a lobbyist named Edward von Kloberg III, except that wasn't his real name. It was Eddie Kloberg. And he was a lobbyist here in DC for every dictator and despot on the planet. And I remember getting a call from his, sitting at my desk working, and I got a call from somebody with a very affected voice saying, hello, dear boy, is this the obituaries desk? And, I thought it's somebody from the Noel Coward School of Drama calling up. And I said, yes, it is. How can I help you? And he said, well, a very distinguished gentleman has died or is very ill. And I think it's very worth your time to do an obituary. Okay, who is it? Here in DC, you always got a lot of people angling in advance. And I said, what's the name? So I was expecting just nothing. Typed in the name, and it's every reference to the man was the vile, the reprehensible Edward von Kloberg, the horrific Edward von Kloberg III. And I said, well, suddenly I was very intrigued, and because I knew it was going to be a very good story regardless. And after I said, I'd be very happy to talk to your friend. It was clearly him. And I called back a little while later and I said, listen, I'd love to talk to you about your life, but I guess I should also mention that Spy magazine did a famous sting on him in the late 80s, where they pretended to be neo-Nazis looking for for lobbying representation in DC. And he said, oh yes, I believe the cause of the fatherland is wonderful. And they had him on tape and all this stuff. And it was just it was pretty low. And when I had this and all these other bits of information in hand, I called him back and I said, listen, I'd love to meet with you, but I don't want you to, snow me on how horribly maligned you were and how misrepresented and everything. He goes, no, I was terrible. And I said, great, because I finally found that he would be, he wasn't angling to massage his image. I mean, to a degree he kind of was, but not in a way that was going to hide the warts and all approach that I like to present as much as I can find. So in that sense, it wound up being actually very useful to fill in some details, some insights that I wouldn't have gotten just from the clips. All the clips would just say he did these things, but then I said, well, give me an example of what you would do for your clients. Everybody is, you're very well known for representing Saddam Hussein and the the junta in Paraguay and that kind of thing. But what can you tell me? What did you actually do for a living? And he said, back in the 80s, when Iraq was our ally against Iranians, he would find any letter to the editor published in any podunk newspaper anywhere and bill Saddam Hussein for actually, he would pretend that he had actually had something to do with the placement of that support. We must support the Iraqis against the terrible Iranians. And, that was a little bit of insight that you could get from somebody that you would never have gotten from any other published article. So in that sense, it was successful. I did one advance interview with a congressman. It was fine. But the key problem with access is often that, you're sort of in debt to your source, and you want to please the person's family. In general, obit writers have less of a problem with this than biographers, because we're just sort of, we're the shock troops parachuting in and out. Whereas everybody else writing a book has to deal with the family and the fallout, and you have, the families are a lot more concerned with how they're probably going to be remembered in book form than one article or another.
Well, certainly we can get to this in a second. The idea of research and reporting around your subject. But one of the things that I was thinking of as you were speaking is that is how sometimes sometimes the idea of interviewing your subject is not especially rewarding. I'm not quite sure how this works in a biography. In the Roth biography, I mean, it was clearly a gigantic help to Blake Bailey, but also Roth was kind of a controlling presence. In an obituary. What you often find, particularly if you're doing something about someone who's very well known, that they've already said everything they're about to say in public forums, in interviews, or in their own books. My one particular example of this is that I wrote the advance obituary of Harold Prince, the Broadway director and producer, and oddly enough, he gave very few interviews. I was surprised to discover, and when he did, he didn't say all that much that was very interesting, at least not after the early 1960s. There was no real, there was one kind of academic biography that wasn't very interesting and didn't get at him personally at all. So I called Stephen Sondheim to ask Sondheim about Prince, and Sondheim was great, and he was happy to talk about his friend, and and to talk about his strengths as a director and how they intersected with his personality and all that. And when it was all over, Sondheim asked me, he said, how come nobody has called me about my obituary? And I said, well, frankly, Mr. Sondheim, I've already written it. And the reason that I didn't call you is that, you've been far more forthcoming than Harold ever was. You wrote 2 books. There's a good biography of you. You've been talking to the press, including the New York Times, including me and the New York Times for many, many years. And he said, he's thought about it for a second. He said, you have a point. And that was the, and that was the end of that discussion. I think I would imagine that for a biographer as well as for an obit writer, you've got to be wary of the of the person that you're writing about. I mean, you're neo-Nazi notwithstanding, there is a tendency on the part of everyone to spin his or her own story.
Bruce, when you're writing about Doctorow, do you wish he were alive? Do you have questions for him that only he could answer at this point, or?
There are some details. That I that I wish he could clarify. I mean, one of the things that I've discovered in the biography is that you tend, in a literary biography anyway, is that you tend to use the things that the writer has said about himself and take them on for face value. But it turns out Dr. O said a lot of things about himself that don't turn out to be true. I mean, one of the most startling ones for me was, I mean, if you know Dr. O's his first really important novel, The Book of Daniel, which was a kind of which used the Rosenberg spy trial as a kind of a historical foundation. I mean, he rewrote it. I mean, it was fiction, but in later years, when Edgar was asked about how he felt about the Rosenbergs while they were being executed, he said he hadn't paid much attention to them, and that when they were executed, he was in the army in Germany. Now, you would think that he would remember that the Rosenbergs were executed in June 1953, and he didn't go into the army until 1954. But the first thing, I took it at face value that when I first read that he had said that, and then I had to rethink it. I'm also not sure that the place he thought of was his first home was actually his first home. So, he talked about growing up at a particular address in the Bronx, but his parents were listed in the phone book somewhere else until he was 2 years old. So, there's, I would like him to be around so I could get to the bottom of things like that. But, one of the other things that I've learned about Edgar was that he was a bit of a control freak, certainly about his own work. And I have a feeling he would have liked to manipulate me. I wrote about him several times, and when people, I said to his wife, I said, I think Edgar liked me well enough. I think he thought my admiration of him was appropriate. And so I think if Edgar knew that I was doing this, he'd want to be a part of it in a way that I wouldn't appreciate.
When we interview, we don't make it mandatory that our obit writers interview their subjects if they're writing in advance, but I leave it as an option. Often we have one writer, Bob McFadden, who does it uniformly. He tries to reach every single subject. And I agree that often you'll get banalities and you'll get maybe even fuzzy memories on things or self-promotional kind of quotes. But we do tell our subjects that whatever they say will not be published until they're dead. It's embargoed. So feel free to speak freely and openly as much as you can. We're always hoping for that revelation that might even be news. We've had a few. I remember when Ed Koch was interviewed for his obituary, actually on videotape. He made some very unkind, disparaging remarks about Mario Cuomo that he probably wouldn't have said while he was alive, but he left it for posterity. So you never know what you might get from that subject if you grill them. So I wouldn't discount it as a source. But by the same token, they're not authorized. They don't become authorized by obituaries. We're not beholden to them. We just mind them and maybe ask them to fact check and clear up things. And we did that recently with Walter Mondale, and actually our advance obit on Henry Kissinger is full of interviews that came late in life with a lot of perspective. So it can sometimes be useful, I would say.
What's interesting to me in terms of whether and how to decide to call your still living subject for an advance obit are the social dynamics of making that call. And this is something that biographers of living subjects clearly also have to deal with on a much longer term basis. But there is no Emily Post for this bizarre social situation where you're saying, in effect, hello, I'm from the New York Times. We know you're getting on in years. We want to sit down with you while you're still alive. And then when you die, which we think will be soon, we're going to put it where millions of people can see it. How do you make that call? The mid-century Timesman Alden Whitman, who was well known for sitting down with his subjects in advance, used to use a wonderful euphemism that I actually have repurposed on occasion. He would say, this is Whitman from the Times, we're updating your biographical file. And people could take on board as much as they could psychologically assimilate. And when I was still in the department some years ago, I called a woman who was already well into her 90s. She's actually still alive. She must be in her late 90s. She invented something at mid-century that everybody used and everybody knew about. It was the newest new thing. But I didn't want my call to seem like a memento mori. I didn't want to seem like a circling vulture, both for human reasons and also because I didn't want to alienate her. It would not be in my interest as a journalist. So I trotted out the thing. This is Fox of the Times. We're updating your biographical file. And God bless her, this 95-year-old woman said gaily, "Oh, you mean you're writing my obituary?" So she could take it. Not everyone can, and I'm sure biographers find likewise.
Well, we're getting some good questions, but I'm going to throw in one more thing for discussion, and then we'll start to get to some of these questions. As I was thinking about this topic, I kept coming back to the fact that as obituarists, we were writing for newspaper readers, and that as a biographer, I'm writing for posterity, to use a to be grandiose about it. Each of those demands has its daunting qualities, but I've arrived at this difference. The obituary concerns itself with what is newsworthy. It's focused on the news, on the newsworthiness of a person. But the biography focuses on recreating the life, the person, him or herself. Now, I'm going to ask Adam if he agrees, knowing that he doesn't. So,
right, I don't. Well, I'd say in a world, we have to choose from thousands of people every day on who we're writing about. So we have to have some criteria or make some kind of judgment on what lives might perhaps be worth writing up that day than others. So there is a news value that does figure into the equation. But I'd say on the posterity front, we have much more in common than not, because I always view obituaries as distinct from most other forms of what's in the daily newspaper, these days online. A lot of it seems like ephemera. Doesn't matter 10 minutes later. And granted, some obituaries can be just as dull and perfunctory as any other badly written story, but I think anybody who wants to do obituary writing for a living understands that we have a strong advantage over any other part of the paper. We have the greatest scope for pure storytelling. Because
when you say anyone who wants to write obituaries for a living, I bet you can count those on one hand.
All three of us. And because
they're all in institutions.
Essentially what we're doing is summing up a human life. And these are all sort of the primal forces in the life: birth, death, the drama of it, the comedy of it, even farce. And I think all of us, whether biographers or people toiling in the daily news business, are not out to carve statues or monuments. Even with the most accomplished of people that we're writing about. And our fundamental obligation as an obituary writer is to make people care about other people, mostly folks that nobody's ever heard of before. And you just don't do that by writing up a resume. You do it by recreating a life, to use your term, trying to ferret out those vivid or revealing details that bring some degree of insight into what the other person's life was like, to make that human connection so that the reader in the newspaper goes, oh, I know exactly what that person was feeling, or I've been there myself, and to lure them into the life. And with obits, basically our challenge more than about, I think you were mentioning this point earlier, Bruce, but I think it's relevant as well now, is that a biographer has lots of room. And for obits, our greatest challenge is often to decide what to leave out more than what to put in. And I can't tell you how many times I've been very satisfied with the story and then had to cut it in half. And I'm the editor, I get to decide these sort of lengths, but at some point, sensibility kicks in, and it's just not practical to have a 200-inch obit on somebody, so, I guess that's kind of what I have to say about that.
Bill, I'd like you to jump in here and talk about deciding the length of an obit, because you've got a really good spiel about that.
No, I was thinking of that exactly. I second Adam's point that there is a certain amount of there's a longer shelf life to an obituary. We find that readers come back to us a year after something has been published, even more. We have now ways of tracking that. We can link in a story, do a hyperlink to an obituary from 5 years ago, and suddenly we'll see a spike in readership. So there's a certain amount of longevity to them, evergreen kind of quality. There's a point at which they do fade away and become kind of archaic. But to your point about length and such, in the old days when we were simply a print operation, the length of an obituary on the page, the sight of it on a page, the amount of space it took up, the number of pictures that were accompanying it, all were reflective of our news judgment about that person. And so we were, in the darker ages, some people might get a 2 or 3 inch obituary, which is essentially a resume. But we have to constantly make decisions about length. I mean, if we want to write 2,000 words on an individual, that person has to have really made an impact on the world. We're kind of saying something to the reader that by our devoting that much time and energy and space, physical space, to that person, we're saying this person is someone much more significant than another. And maybe there's someone on the more of a B team level, and maybe we only want to do 800 words on that person, because then that will reflect our news judgment in effect on that person's relative importance. So that's something biographers don't have to worry about. Every book can be 400 pages long. But because we're talking more journalistically in terms of obituaries, we are a part of a news report. We have to make those kinds of judgments on, how much we're devoting to that person and what that says about our view of that person.
Well, we've got the questions are coming in, so I think maybe I'll start with them. Some of them will be familiar to all of us as obit writers, because we get asked them all the time. As no autobiography can be complete, has anyone on the panel written his or her own obituary?
No.
Of course not.
What? Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is, why do you know something that I don't know? But I generally say that obituaries are for the living. They're not they're not for the dead. So I don't feel like I have a responsibility to create my own obituary while I'm alive. And I don't really care what it says after I'm dead. So I guess the answer to that is no. Obit writers often speak with family and friends about the deceased. This engages the same issues of trustworthy sources that biographers deal with. I'd like to hear the obit writers comment. We've talked about this a little in terms of talking with the actual person, but Margot, why don't you speak about some of your engagements with family and friends?
What's interesting is you learn more about family dysfunction as an obit writer than anyone except perhaps a psychotherapist. And you also learn about family folklore and the stories that in all good faith have trickled down in the oral culture of the family that may not be strictly true or may not be true at all. And of course, in our work, as in all of yours, a miss is as good as a mile. So we speak to the families really for two reasons and two reasons only, much as you all do, but in much a much more concentrated way. One, as a courtesy, and two, because at least in theory, the families are better positioned than anyone else to supply accurate biographical information. And indeed, most of the most basic vital statistics, where was he born, when was he born, parents' names, there is no better source than the families. For more anecdotal stuff, did dad raise the flag at Iwo Jima? You know, mercifully, there were only 6 guys on that mountain. That's easily checked. Was dad at the Battle of Bunker Hill? Was dad on Omaha Beach in Normandy? People tell you this very rarely with actual intent to dissemble, but it's what is believed in the family. And you smile and nod and you make a note. And as soon as you get off the phone with him, you check it elsewhere with independent sources. You take what the family says about dad or granddad and put it in the paper wholesale at your peril. And we've all learned that the hard way.
Speaking of peril, here's the next question, and I'd like to thank Kai Bird for asking this particularly embarrassing question. Every biography contains errors inevitably. So, what is the worst factual mistake any of you have made as obituary writers?
Oh, well, you know, this blanket disclaimer, this happened before any of us was in the department. We killed someone who wasn't dead. The famous Russian ballerina.
More than once, there was the ballet dancer, but there was also the hoaxer, right?
Oh, yeah, there was a fascinating man named Alan Abel, who was a professional hoaxer. And way back in 1980, he got a genuine, credulous, full news obituary in the Times. And he had orchestrated that operation like a general doing a military coup. He had a fake funeral home set up with a fake telephone line, a real telephone line, a fake business directory listing, a fake grieving widow. And he knew the Times would do its due diligence. The Times called all those people who were hired actors, got the confirmation and printed the obit, and with great chagrin had to run a retraction a couple of days later. I had both the delicious and unenviable task of doing his obit when he ostensibly actually did die. And I actually wrote it as an advance, and then happily I retired, so I didn't have to do the confirmation. It was somebody else's problem. We're still waiting for him to rise from the grave, but this time it seems to be the real deal.
I would say the worst mistake that I ever made was, I believe the daughter, I was doing the obituary of a well-known designer of album covers, and I believed his daughter when she said that he had designed the cover of Beggar's Banquet by the Rolling Stones, and we printed it, and it turned out it was somebody else altogether.
The worst kinds of corrections are not so much that specific, although the specific ones can be terribly mortifying. But it's when you get a kind of a litany of them and it's from the same obituary, and we run a kind of a correction that's a yard long. Those are the most painful, and they destroy your credibility. And we've had a few unfortunate cases like that.
What's really interesting, sort of in terms of the epistemology of doing what we do and doing what you all do, is the categories of experience that tells you where the minds are seated. And for obit writers, it's claims of being the first to do something, the last to have done something, or the inventor of something. The minute you hear, oh, you're going to get to do the obit of the inventor of the TV dinner, when you're green, you get very excited because, oh, that's going to be so much fun. They might even refer it on page 1. When you've been around the block a few times in obits and you hear that, your stomach goes into a knot, because odds are somebody else invented the TV dinner 5 minutes before your guy.
On that note, just to go back to a previous question, I really discourage, other than just getting the most basic information about when and where, and what you hope is an accurate list of survivors, I really don't like talking to families. because they're the best example I can give is, I mean, as Margaret was saying, it's an insight into family dysfunction, but also not necessarily on purpose. It's amazing how people just know so little about the driving forces in the lives of their closest relatives. We had a man in the military die, and his wife, his widow, called up to request an obituary and was giving our reporter a list of assignments that the person had, and it was on. He said this man was in the Coast Guard and had served as executive officer of this, that, and the other ship, and when we went to double check those things, because it's just there's nothing worse than going to great lengths to get the larger picture right and then putting an extra letter in the name of a ship, and we discovered that they're on Navy ships, not Coast Guard. So we said, excuse me, you had mentioned he was in the Coast Guard. Oh, it has something to do with ships, and that's the kind of not quite newspaper-like lack of accuracy that often families give us. So we're very, very wary, and checking it, the more facts you have, the more landmines you're dealing with.
And you really learn about who hates whom in families. And I'm sure biographers have this to deal with all the time. You will get, when it comes to the question of survivors, which can be very delicate, families are complex things in the 21st century. You will ask what should be a very innocuous question, like, how many children did he have, and who are they? What are their names? And you will get people, grown children, who will accidentally, on purpose, omit an entire branch of half siblings or step siblings, and you don't even know about it until they call you screaming and crying the next day, saying, "How dare you write me out of my father's story?" So we've learned preemptively to ask all those questions. Were there other marriages? Were there other children? Occasionally, though, you get a story you can dine out on for years. And one of our colleagues, who is still in the department, asked he was speaking to a widow, I guess a youngish widow, about her husband's family background, asked a very innocuous question: what was his mother's name? And the wife says, "Bitch."
Yeah, we find that, or families are. I agree with what Adam was saying, that families can sometimes want to orchestrate the obit. They want to manipulate us. They want us to leave out maybe some unsavory facts that we want to put in. We feel we must put in. We had a case like that recently, where a very prominent research scientist was caught up in some kind of nefarious activities, embezzlement, I believe, and was forced to resign from a very high post. And there was a campaign by the family, by people who knew the family, very prominent people, who kept emailing us to tell us that we shouldn't be mentioning this. This is unfair to the deceased. And we, of course, did. It amounted to maybe 2 paragraphs out of the story. But still, that families can often be the most unreliable sources in some ways.
And what we tell families when they start trying to stage manage coverage is, I think, very much in line with what biographers have to say or are thinking the whole time, which is, these are not eulogies. We must have complete fealty to history.
It's a good question here. Where are the tapes and full transcripts of interviews conducted for newspaper obituaries stored? Can biographers and other researchers gain access to them? It's an interesting question, because most of us, I think, don't actually tape interviews. At least not on the daily, not in the daily obits. We're usually on the phone and typing away, because we don't have time to record interviews and then transcribe them. But but I would say that it's still a good question, because newspaper writers and magazine writers, they do long interviews with subjects, and they often keep their tapes. I did a magazine piece about Raymond Carver in 1983 or 85, something like that. And his biographer, Carol Sklenecka, asked me, called me and said, "I saw you did this. Do you still have your tapes?" And I happily gave them to her. I did a magazine piece about Yale Doctorow in 1985, and I still have the tapes. And the tapes are full of stuff that I didn't use in the story. So I would encourage any biographer to get in touch with any reporter who had done some kind of a lengthy story about the subject. There may be some hidden gems in the recordings that they did. Let's see. I'd like to have Margot return to her remark about the themes of the subject's life and consider it in terms of any conflict between what the subject saw as the themes of their life versus the themes the public and the audience see as the themes that are important in their lives. Is Woody Allen a good example of this?
Woody Allen, I'm happy to say I've never been involved with, and you can take that any way you want to. I'm not quite, if by themes, do you mean what a reporter would call angle? I think having themes may be a luxury on a daily paper. I think themes are something you have in a book. What I was saying before, and I hope this speaks to your question, is, I know, here's the best way to look at it. This is going to sound preposterous, but bear with me. In terms of what we do, the two historical figures who are the most relevant in this case are Marcel Duchamp and Alfred Hitchcock. And here's what I mean. Marcel Duchamp, of course, particularly in his later career, made a lot of art from found objects, his ready-mades. And I've long thought that that's what we do as obit writers, where in our case, our found objects are historical facts, themes, if you prefer. And to those, we have to have complete fealty. We can't alter them in any way. Once confirmed, they go in unalterable. But as Bruce has spoken about, how even or especially in the context of a 1,000-word obit, how do you choose which to include? You're only going to have room for maybe 5% of the stuff you encounter, all of your ready-made facts. And that's where Hitchcock comes in, because Hitchcock said, art is life with the dull bits left out. And that pretty much tells you what to do. Those for me have always been words to live by, where we're trying to make really a good piece of art in terms of narrative, in terms of using anecdote, humor where appropriate, dialogue even, something that does all of the work of a newspaper obit of old in terms of those unalterable facts, but something that reads like a piece of art. I don't know if that gets to your question about themes, but it just tells you where my head has been the last couple of years I was doing this job.
Here's another question that a little kind of sneaky at the end, but we'll get into it anyway. Can you comment on the practice of publishing obituaries on the more obscure figures? For example, the victims of 9/11 or other tragedies, the yearly, the lives they led section, more recently, the pieces on overlooked lives. Is this kind of obituary always justified from a news standpoint, or does political correctness sometimes intervene? What do you think, Bill?
Well, I don't think I would say it's not about political correctness. Most recently, we've been doing obituaries on the victims of the pandemic, a kind of recognition of the lives that were lost, and trying to create a cross-section or portray a cross-section of those who died of it. By no means definitive or complete, but certainly a kind of representation, if you will. But we didn't do it for political reasons. We did it for journalistic reasons. We thought that this pandemic was affecting so many people in all walks of life, rich and poor, probably predominantly poor, but still it was somewhat egalitarian in that sense. So we thought we would portray that excuse me, in a journalistic fashion, to kind of, again, which is what journalism does. It tries to present a picture of the world in some fashion. And yeah, there's a certain amount of artifice to it, as Margot was saying, that any obituary can be written one way or another. And if you read ours, Obit on Walter Mondale, it may sound very different from, not completely different, but slightly different from what Adam published in the Post, because two different writers may have approached it differently. But I'm not sure if that answers the question completely, but the kinds of people that this questioner was referring to, I suppose, victims of 9/11 and such, they are a different category of victims of an event, of a calamity of one kind or another. And so we approach them differently, with a slightly different standard of judgment as we do our standard obituaries.
The overlooked section, I mean, began as it began because the paper had shamefully overlooked people of color, right, and particularly particularly women of color. You can call that politically correct if you want, but it seems to me to be it's only because we had been historically incorrect in the past, and that's what we were acknowledging.
And also, it reflects that particular project reflects a different news judgment that we now hold, as opposed to what might have been, extant, if that's the word, years ago. News judgment then might have, uniformly overlooked people who weren't in prominent positions, who weren't CEOs, and who weren't political figures, the traditional movers and shakers. So we're recognizing those people who were, in some cases, overlooked, or in some cases we just never knew about. The paper probably was never, informed of their deaths. But so it reflects as well a kind of a different evolution of news judgment.
Well, I feel compelled to say that it's now 12:04. Which I guess means that officially this panel is over, but we'll stick around for another 20 minutes and continue to answer questions.
Can I just make one quick comment on leapfrogging off of what Bill had just mentioned? I mean, the idea of obscurity is very in the eye of the beholder. Most people we're writing about are obscure, just to except for the obvious page one candidates. I happen to have a deep interest in arts and entertainment, and it's sort of a joke on my desk that what old French movie star has died now that you want to write about? To me, they're not obscure. To me, they're worthy of exploration, of examination, and of presenting them to a public. There's an educational role of obit writing that is often unexamined. I mean, basically our job is to investigate the life and then explain to readers, and sometimes even our editors, why we're spending X amount of space on writing up this life, as opposed to somebody that might seem a little bit more dutiful or predictable. It's because, we're all human, and we all take particular interests we all have our particular interests. Margot, I think you're a cellist, right? So you might have a deeper knowledge of a cellist that I've never heard of before, and bring a great deal of passion and expertise to it that that makes it a great read. And somebody might say, I've never heard of this person, pretty obscure. So I think it's a judgment call on I'm rambling a little bit here, but I think obscurity is not quite the way to think about it. It is what makes for a great story.
Well, the other thing is to think about. I mean, Bill has made this point in the past, and that every year about 55 million people die. Between 55 and 60 million people around the world die. That's the population of Italy, and our newspapers publish about 1,000 obits. So that's some serious triage.
Yeah, we always say it's like being on the admissions committee of the most selective college in the world. It's damn hard to get in.
What is the lodestone you use to decide on the theme of an obituary? Do you have a rule of thumb or a structural framework that helps facilitate that process?
Again, I think I should make a blanket disclaimer for myself. My normal waking hours end at 4 a.m. So normally at this time I'd just be getting up. So if I'm a little fuzzy on what is meant by a theme, it's just I'm not caffeinated and I'm more deeply stupid even than my age would allow for. Structurally, we've got that wonderful inverted pyramid news story to fall back on every time. Thanks to Bill and other papers are, of course, doing likewise. We can now play with that. And that structure has become wonderfully elastic. We're not married to the rigid hard news leads anymore, which, 40, 50 years ago made obits really, really boring. We can have anecdotal leads where appropriate. But if you look, and this gets back to the very first things I said, this is where the obit, just as any news story structurally, if gridded up 100-fold would give you a book, so too an obit structurally, if gridded up, will give you a biography. I'm not talking about content, themes, if you will, but all of that formal architecture has to be there because the structure of a newspaper story is basically an information processing model. It goes back to the 19th century when things were transmitted by telegraphs. It came to being in the Civil War. And if you don't hew to that model, you're going to have a very disorganized story that can't be processed intellectually by readers nearly as easily. So you still hew to that, but the trick is to hide it with interesting artifice like dialogue, like anecdote, like even jokes where Robin Williams were appropriate. So that's what it is we do now.
Has there ever been an unexpected obit that you had to deliver but wanted to avoid because you perhaps felt too emotionally connected to the subject? That's a good question.
I don't think that, one requirement of journalism is dispassion, and you really can't be too emotionally involved in the subjects you're writing about, even if you felt very fond of, say, a pop star who you're a devoted listener to, or I think you do divorce yourself from that partiality. I think of a doctor or a cop. They have to do their jobs regardless of who it is. They can't be emotionally involved in the subject. So I think we approach our subjects in the same way. Sometimes, a person may die who were, shocked, to discover. I remember when Prince died and unexpectedly. We had some devoted fans of Prince who were beside themselves right in our department. But we proceeded to do the story, impartially, dispassionately, as we have to do.
I wrote
Suicides are hard. Pardon me. Suicides, particularly young suicides, rip your guts out because we're people. But again, as Bill says, you have to have a dispassionate, almost clinical approach. Very, very hard to call the family, just even for basic information in that situation, but you have to. The most intense obit I ever did was on a writer who tragically had blown his brains out. I'd heard that from other sources, but I need to confirm it. Again, talk about no Emily Post. How do you ever make that call? And so I called the widow, the brand new widow, said who I was, who I worked for, and just going on instinct, I would normally never be this familiar with the source, but I took a deep, silent breath and I said, honey, what the hell happened? And God bless her, she told me.
I wrote a small handful of obits of people that I knew pretty well, perhaps unwisely. I decided to do it, and I would say that the advantage to doing that is that you can add a kind of personal touch that wouldn't be there otherwise, and the disadvantage is that you wander a little bit too close to eulogy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bruce.
I'm sorry, which is one of the questions we have here. How do obituaries differ from eulogies? And I mean, and that's basically the difference. I mean, your job isn't to acclaim the person, or but at the same time, a good obituary can accomplish what eulogies sometimes do, which is to make you feel as if you knew the person.
Sort of, I come not to praise.
We come to bury Caesar,
but
not to
I come
praise
to
him.
bury him, and that's what we do. We have to refrain from the eulogies. We leave that to the families and the memorial services. We're not. Often readers will be kind of aghast that we may speak ill of the dead, which is somehow a social taboo. But not in a newspaper, not in journalism.
And remember, we've done obituaries of some of the most reprehensible people on earth because they're newsworthy. We've all done Nazi war criminals. How do you think those of us, well, who are A, Jewish, and B, more broadly human beings, feel about that? I did the obit of Sheriff Clark, who was, beating protesters on the head with a cudgel as they came across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I did the obit of Charles Manson. And no, I did not talk to his family.
Here's one that's a question that's a little bit puzzling to me. Maybe there's some Times lore that that I'm not familiar with. Richard Avedon wrote that he updated his Times obit every year. Please comment.
I doubt that happened at all.
He may have sent stuff in, but it didn't mean he had access to the obit, right, Bill?
I've often said that, with advance obits, I've often thought it was okay to give people their advance obit to read and let them suggest changes, because they'll never know when you don't pay any attention to them.
I didn't know you were doing that, Bruce.
What? I didn't do it.
No.
You're fired, Bruce.
Yeah.
But that is verboten. We never share an advance obituary with the subject. They can offer information if they want, keep us apprised of what they're doing in their lives, which is great. But no, they don't see the obit itself.
Here's a question for you, Bill. How many obits get dropped for lack of space?
We're talking about the print section. Very few. We try to publish everything in print that we publish online, but there is often a lag because we cannot get the ball in one day. We have a certain very finite amount of space in any daily paper. So an obituary that may appear online immediately in 1 day's time, it may take 3 days for it to get into the paper for lack of space, because other obituaries are more pressing, more important, and they push it out. But I would say a very small percentage, maybe 3%, if that.
Question for Margot. Can you point to a particular obituary that was especially challenging to put together?
Well, challenging emotionally, what I've spoken about, the suicides. Strikingly, we all did maybe 120, 140 obits a year, and you might have one suicide, so mercifully less than 1%. But of the dozen or so suicides I've had in my 14 years on obits, 11 of the 12 have been poets. So do not let your children grow up to be poets. It's a bad risk. And I had a fantasy that if you were an insurance company, you'd never write a policy for a poet, at least not after Wallace Stevens retired, because he was the real deal and he knew it. Seriously, the great villains of history are hard. The Charles Mansons, the Sheriff Jim Clarks, but you have to do them. You have to do them straight down the line. You have to be very detached and, dare I say it, clinical about it.
I would say that the most difficult ones were, the experts in the field in the fields that I didn't understand, like advanced mathematics or philosophy or nuclear physics, that kind of stuff. I mean, it would take forever to because it's sort of twofold. First, you have to understand what they did and why it was important, and second, you had to render it in language that your readers would understand. So a lot of those obits involve calling close colleagues of the person and saying, well, what if I said this? And what if I said that? And they, sort of coaching you through the, you know, the language, the precise language that's necessary to sort of render what these people did with any accuracy.
I think hands down, I mean, there is that challenge, of course, but hands down, the worst consistently excruciating kinds of obituaries to write are about people you work with. Because you immediately have 500 editors helpfully descending on you to tell you exactly how it should be done. And, you know, one of the greatest things about obit writing is that we're largely left alone. You know, I know it's hard to believe we're not the, you know, most prestigious part of the newsroom necessarily. And, you know, there's a liberation in that. At the same time, every so often you'll get, you know, it's upsetting to write about somebody you may have known, but you know, the hardest one was actually the second wife of Ben Bradley, who had a career as an artist, and you know, it was decided that he had to read the story. So I had to bring it up to him to show him, and I discovered stuff that I discovered that apparently JFK had made a pass at her, and it was in her own words, and it was an obscure oral history that I came across, and had to present it, and I felt like, you know, Albert Brooks in broadcast news, just, you know, sweating as I, you know, this is 15 years ago, and he said, oh, yeah, it's fine, it's accurate, you know, and kind of moved on from there, but it was terrifying.
The two final questions have just come in. Can biographers learn from obituary writers how to be succinct, how to write short?
We can't learn it ourselves.
That's right. It's ask, you know, Bill and Adam will tell you that obituary writers themselves need to learn how to do that.
I would second that. Oh, but of course, by that token, you know, what an obituary writer does, when an obituary writer goes over length and writes 2,500 words, that would account for about 4 or 5 pages in a biography. So even then, they are writing succinct, you might say. But
we don't have enough time to write short, isn't that the old line?
It's true.
And it's true that Cummings has a file of advance obits for self-destructive 20 or 30 somethings. I don't know whether you do any more, Bill, but I remember our discussions about people like Britney Spears and Charlie Sheen and, you know, the people who were going off the rails. And my argument was always that, you know, they seem important right now, but the longer, you know, it might end up being, you know, a waste of time and energy, because the longer these people live, the shorter their obituaries are going to be.
That's true.
And obit staffs are small, so in terms of triage, unless we hear that a newsworthy 20-something, you know, has some terrible terminal illness, we're probably going to give them a pass on advances, because Bill and Adam have their hands full as it is doing, you know, the authentically aged newsworthy pre-dead people who need advances.
I remember that the big awakening on this to this question was the death of Brittany Murphy, who this is probably 10 or 12 years ago. And I barely, you know, I know about films, but I knew her to be sort of kind of supporting actress, relatively second tier in the sphere of great actresses from the 90s and 2000s. And she died suddenly on a weekend. And there was this great demand for information, you know, great readership demand. There was hundreds of thousands of clicks. And it was an awakening to just, you know, the need to be ready on younger people in general. And so I immediately ordered up an Amy Winehouse obituary, immediately. And I think we're the only paper that had it for many hours. I had a reporter who knew a lot about music write it up. And it was sheer luck.
I think that probably brings us to the end here. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And thank you to my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Happy Sunday.
And thank you, Michael.
Thank you.